instructor, Billy Haze. You may remember me as the inventor of minoxicline and Delta Scrub when I was still a living human being. But I've been dead for several years. So, I know that all of you are freshly dead and were recently interred in this very graveyard, and that you have questions about the afterlife. So, I and several other of my compatriot ghosts have set up these classes to instruct you in the ins and outs of being a ghost. Now, I'm sure that many of you come from religious traditions that involve some form of reward and punishment in the afterlife. Well, the truth is, the afterlife is much more complicated than any of you were raised to believe. I know that you also have questions about why you haven't passed on to whatever possible afterlife or reincarnation you expect. And I'm sure you're also curious as to why you look like you belong on the Dairy Queen menu. Of course, we'll explain that later, because I'm not the one who's going to teach that class. But you will have classes on flight, successful haunting, and object possession. The last you should be very careful about attempting. But no, I'm here to teach you about the hierarchy of the undead. Now, when I say the hierarchy of the undead, I don't mean to say that one kind of undead is better than any other kind of undead. I'm just telling you about the levels of power between different kinds of undead, and which ones you don't want to make angry. So, before I begin, do you have any questions?
So, is there a reason why we're so, fat?
Yes, you're asking about our, girth and, enlarged posteriors. Well, you see, a ghost's size is determined by the amount of mystical energy in the area that our bodies convert into ectoplasm. So, this graveyard, for example, has considerable mystical energy, so we're gonna be quite a bit round. But if we're in areas with limited mystical energy, well, we get very flat. This was me one time when there wasn't a lot of energy around. So that's why people think of ghosts as being in sheets, because when we don't have enough energy around, we get flat. So, describing the hierarchy of the undead. So, the agreed upon masters of all undead are vampires. Pale, cruel aristocrats who feast on the blood of others to maintain their accursed immortality. They're better looking than we are, more socially charming than we are, and have a very high opinion of themselves. So, roughly equivalent in power and ability to vampires, and in many cases, believing themselves to be superior to vampires, are liches. If you have never heard of a lich, well, clearly you didn't play a lot of Dungeons & Dragons, but I'll just say this, they're basically Skeletor, okay? So, a lich is an evil magic user who, unwilling to accept death, has enchanted himself and committed a ritual act of great depravity, allowing him to live on as a rotting corpse, so long as his soul is protected by a phylactery, an amulet-like object that he must maintain at all times. Similar to a vampire, a lich must feed on the life energy of others in the form of sucking out their souls. I should point out that this makes liches dangerous to ghosts, as essentially we're big, tasty, floating souls. So you have to be very careful to avoid liches, but luckily enough, they're not very common. Next, we have the forms of non-corporeal undead. So those of us who no longer have a body beyond ectoplasm. So this includes apparitions, who are in many ways equivalent to us, but with fewer powers and locked into a facsimile of their mortal form, as opposed to us ghosts, who have more abilities and a rotund, shapeless form. So, we are essentially the hardworking middle class of the undead. We're not as high as vampires and liches, but we're not as low as zombies, which I'll discuss later. So, beneath us, or sometimes higher than us in the hierarchy, are mummies. So, mummies are very variable in terms of power, ability, and intelligence. Some of the more sophisticated and powerful forms of mummy are roughly equivalent to a lich or vampire. Others are barely thinking, shambling corpses, subservient to the will of others, more like a zombie. So when it comes to mummies, you don't want to mess with them, you just don't know how powerful they might be. So, you ask, what else is beneath us? Well, before you mention ghouls, I must point out that ghouls are not undead, despite what Dungeons & Dragons may say. Ghouls are a kind of demon that devour the corpses of the dead. Not saying we have to worry about it, we don't have bodies anymore. But ghouls are not a form of undead, and not anything we have to worry about. And we will also be providing classes to discuss other kinds of spiritual beings that are not undead, like angels and demons and fairies and gods and elementals. But I'm not covering that. So finally, we have the lowest form of undead, the zombie, a animated corpse, possibly by voodoo magic, possibly by toxic waste, possibly created by failed space probes with radiation, or sometimes just because hell has gotten too full and the dead are walking the earth. You have to understand, demons are lazy and sometimes need to dig more tunnels. But it can be even worse when sometimes heaven gets too full and the dead walk the earth. Nothing is any sadder than watching 20 zombies try to rescue a kitten from a tree. It's sad. So, now that I've presented the hierarchy of the undead, do any of my fellow ghosts have any other questions I need to answer? Okay, well, I know that was a lot to take in. Some of my fellow older ghosts will be explaining other aspects of our ectoplasmic nature. Just remember that you can, in fact, slime people. So if anyone's really annoying you, just ram them. And they will be covered in sticky ectoplasm. So Ghostbusters got that right. Anyway, I'll move along and let you get on with your afterlife. Oh, in terms of terminology, I should point out that we ghosts prefer to be called spectral Americans.